going to give maybe a complex answer. I'm going to try to do it quickly, but I think it's valid to be angry. And I think as an emotion, anger is very poorly understood because I think we associate anger very often with behaviors and actions that are potentially aggressive or violent. But I think if we understand anger as a social emotion as opposed to an individual emotion. And so the way that any emotion works, it has a particular script. An emotion has a script that says, I'm perceiving something in my environment. I have this very automatic, hardwired, and pretty universal human response to this particular threat. And then the sequence of changes in my thoughts and my body and my minds are meant to help me with this particular threat. So we've talked about anxiety. So anxiety is I perceive danger, and then so the change inside of a human being is fight or flight becomes a response. So anger as a human emotion happens when we perceive something in our social environment as being wrong. Like, that's not right. Now, if we perceive that something in our environment is not right, and we believe it's our own fault, then that emotion is guilt. And if it's something that we can't do anything about, that emotion is regret. However, if we perceive something in our environment that we're experiencing that feels wrong, but we actually know that we didn't do anything to bring that or make that happen, and we understand that somebody else is responsible for this negative act, then the natural, healthy human response in that moment is anger. And then so if we follow the emotional script of anger, what anger does is it actually is meant to do a couple of things. But the end point of anger is ultimately to try to make that wrong thing, is to make it right. And I mentioned that it's a social emotion. So what that means is it's actually not always meant to be done by yourself. So if you think about when you get angry about something, maybe you can confront that person directly. Hey, that's not right. Fix it. If we're in the right situation. Another thing that can happen sometimes is if we don't think that person is necessarily going to respond, or we don't necessarily feel that by ourselves we can articulate or be persuasive or do it safely enough, we actually, as a human emotion of anger, we kind of try to recruit other people like, hey, did you see that? That's messed up, right? And so this is a social aspect of emotion. So if you can make sense of anger as a social, healthy, valid emotion, one way to say it is that the purpose of anger is to address and eliminate injustice, like things that are wrong in the communities in which we live. So I'm going to say that again. The purpose of anger is to address and eliminate injustice in the communities in which we live through social action. So one of the ways that happens is that we build alliances. We get other people that get what we see as being wrong, and then we automatically form these communities. So for example, I think intuitively, right, we kind of know this, and things like what Russell did, in responding to this and forming groups of like-minded people. And the other thing about anger is, it's meant to be settled in public. It's meant to because it's a community thing, it's a social thing. So when we point to an injustice, it's supposed to be like, hey, does everybody see what's going on? Can we all agree that this is wrong? So at the heart of it, if we're talking about even historical movements against racism, like the civil rights movement, what you end up having is you form an alliance of allies that's large enough, powerful enough, persuasive enough, so that you actually start getting other people in the society who maybe have the power, the influence, and maybe this connects to things like political action, for example. You get the people that can do something about it to reverse an injustice and make it right. Now, anger is, because it's one of these emotions that we don't practice a lot, it's kind of like riding a bike. If you've tried to teach a kid how to ride a bike, or you remember your own experience in riding a bike, a lot of the beginning and the experience of riding a bike is falling and getting hurt. And if you never complete the process of learning how to ride a bike, all your associations and memories of a bicycle are going to be with pain and suffering. But if you get past all that and you learn how to ride a bike, then ultimately you understand that a bike is a great tool. It's faster than walking. You can get to your friend's house, faster instead of whatever it may be. And so anger, unfortunately, I think is one of these human emotions that we've all have only gotten to the point where we've fallen off the bike several times, and our experiences with anger, including other people's anger, often are associations with negativity. But I just want to point out that we also, as a group, especially if you're justice oriented, especially if you've been involved in any sort of like political action, we've all have then also channeled anger in very healthy ways. We've done it through alliances. We've done it through group action. We've done it through the reassurance and the comfort that comes from other like-minded people that validate our experiences. It's part of the comfort of knowing I can do this. And the interesting thing about anger, that once you start doing these things, is that there's the immediate sort of like hotness of anger, but the long-term experience of anger, because it points towards justice, is actually a lot of patience and a lot of diligence, where people can do things like be participants in justice movements for their whole life. And the beginning of that, you know, when people talk about the origins as to how did you get involved in this, why did you start caring, most people will talk about an incident where they saw something wrong and they could not unsee it. And it created a conviction in them where they said, you know, as long as this takes, I'm going to make this right. And so I think racism, you know, and like Russell said, I think for a lot of Asian Americans, because of the sort of odd position sometimes Asian Americans have as people of color, as sometimes being invisible in the black and white race conversation. But, you know, another way to, I think, to talk about the Asian American racial experience is you're white until you're not. And this is one of those experiences, you know, that we have. But I think a lot of Asian Americans are coming to this conversation and recognizing that, you know, racism is still a problem. Hopefully a lot of Asian Americans are recognizing that racism is a systemic, historical issue. So it's not going to be solved just by, you know, punching a bully in the face in the supermarket, but it really was going to require, again, social, community, historical, probably political, sort of large scale social community action. But again, I'm saying that, you know, anger, if we can get in touch with that and validate that even to ourselves, that becomes actually a healthy way for us to channel that energy into something that makes something in our community, something in our environment that is very, very wrong, racism and acts of racism. And we try to do something about that. And our goal is to make a society not just less racist, but anti-racist, right? Like these can become our goals. And that becomes something that I think we can connect with even in our faith, which is that we are trying to make an unjust world more just. And I think that if we're thinking about, you know, goodness and badness or good and evil in that context, then I think we can make sense that if we fight racism on an individual or but probably more as a community together, we're bringing more good into our communities. We're bringing more righteousness. We're bringing more justice into our environments. And I think that folds also nicely into a theology that's not necessarily just talking about like personal salvation, but a theology and understanding of God that is loving, that is justice oriented, you know, that we can interweave all these ideas together as well. And we can also do it in a very grounded sort of here and now, kingdom on earth kind of way, as opposed to, I don't know, esoteric treasures in heaven kind of way, you know, and we can sort of like fold it into our lived faith in the here and the now.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So I want to agree with Joseph that we need to actually respond well with righteous anger in a social, communal way. And another response with this anger is to then develop empathy with other people who are racially profiled, right? And so that we, now that Asian Americans are seeing, wow, people see us as a threat, people see us as outsiders, people see us as disease, then we should be able to develop empathy with people who are being detained at the border, with people who are being mass incarcerated, who people are being banned, right? And so now other immigrants, Asians as immigrants, are being banned as well. So you go from this righteous anger then to an empathy that's like, wow, the whole world is pretty unjust. The system is pretty screwed up. And you pray every day, we want God's kingdom, let that come, not this world. And so for me, one of the responses of anger is hopefully developing a greater sense of empathy and solidarity with others. Another response is lament, is rueing the way the world is and how it's harmed people and how people suffer. And it's also developing compassion for both those who are hurting and also the bullies, the perpetrators, because they're equally wounded and need reconciliation and, like Joseph said, restorative justice that restores both parties, both the perpetrator and the victim. And so there's a lot of I think our church has a lot of responses. I don't know how the world has these responses. Let's just fight back and be activists, and or we have hashtag, we'll post it, and that'll be, that's our way of responding. But I think the church has really good time-tested ways of responding to injustice, responding to exile, to responding to being like Jesus, spat upon and mistreated and betrayed, and that's the church has all these years, decades, millennia of wisdom that we need to draw on during this particular period.